CPI's coal plant emission data falsification scheme. When investors think about clean energy transitions in Asia's largest economy, China Power International Development Limited seems like the perfect corporate success story. Founded in 1994 and listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange since 2004, CPI operates as one of China's largest independent power producers, with a portfolio spanning coal-fired plants, hydroelectric facilities, wind farms, and solar installations across 18 provinces. The company manages over 38 gigawatts of installed capacity, enough to power roughly 28 million homes, and has consistently marketed itself as a leader in environmental stewardship and sustainable energy development. Their annual reports from the late 2010s proudly showcased investments exceeding 8 billion yuan in environmental protection upgrades, emission reduction technologies, and compliance with China's increasingly stringent environmental standards. CPI's management regularly appeared at international energy conferences, touting their commitment to reducing carbon intensity and supporting Beijing's ambitious climate goals. The company's stock price reflected this green transformation narrative, climbing steadily as ESG-focused institutional investors allocated billions toward what appeared to be a responsibly managed utility transitioning toward cleaner generation sources. But beneath this carefully constructed facade of environmental responsibility lay one of the most systematic and technologically sophisticated emissions data falsification schemes ever uncovered in China's power sector, a deception that would ultimately expose how corporate fraud can undermine entire nations' environmental commitments. The falsification scheme centered on CPI's coal-fired power plants, which, despite the company's green marketing rhetoric, still comprised over 70% of their total generation capacity as of 2020. These facilities were subject to China's revised environmental protection law, implemented in 2015 and dubbed the strictest environmental legislation in the country's history, along with the ultra-low emission standards that required coal plants to meet emission limits previously only applied to natural gas facilities. Under these regulations, CPI's coal plants were required to install continuous emission monitoring systems, known as CEMS, that would automatically measure and report sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter emissions to provincial environmental authorities and the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in real time. The monitoring data was not merely regulatory paperwork, but formed the basis for emission trading calculations, environmental tax assessments, and potential criminal penalties for violations. CPI's facilities were also subject to random inspections, annual compliance audits, and required to maintain detailed operational logs that could be cross-referenced with the automated monitoring data. The company's environmental compliance costs were substantial, with legitimate ultra-low emission retrofits typically costing between 50 and 100 million yuan per unit, but the penalties for non-compliance were even steeper, including fines up to 1 million yuan per day for violations, potential criminal charges for responsible executives, and possible plant shutdowns that could cost hundreds of millions in lost revenue. Rather than invest in the expensive emission control equipment required for legitimate compliance, CPI's management decided to manipulate the monitoring systems themselves. The scheme was orchestrated primarily by the company's Environmental Affairs Department, working in coordination with plant-level operations managers and selected technicians who had administrative access to the CEMS networks. The manipulation took several forms, each designed to create the appearance of regulatory compliance while allowing the plants to operate with minimal emission controls. The most common technique involved installing bypass software on the monitoring equipment that would substitute pre-recorded clean emission readings whenever actual measurements exceeded regulatory limits. This software was sophisticated enough to generate realistic variation patterns that would not trigger automated anomaly detection systems used by regulators, incorporating factors like seasonal weather changes, load variations, and maintenance schedules that would naturally affect emission levels. At several facilities, CPI personnel physically modified the CEMS hardware, installing parallel sensors that could be remotely activated to provide false readings during regulatory inspections or when actual emissions spiked beyond acceptable levels. The company also employed a technique called data smoothing, where automated systems would average emission readings over extended periods, effectively diluting high pollution episodes with lower baseline readings to meet regulatory thresholds on paper. Perhaps most brazenly, CPI developed a system of coordinated operational adjustments where plants would temporarily increase emission controls and reduce output during scheduled inspections, then return to normal high-pollution operations once inspectors departed, with the monitoring systems programmed to continue reporting the artificially low readings from the inspection period. The financial motivations driving this elaborate deception were enormous, reflecting the fundamental tension between environmental compliance costs and shareholder returns in China's power sector. Legitimate ultra-low emission compliance would have required CPI to invest approximately 4 billion yuan across their coal fleet, equivalent to nearly 40% of the company's total annual revenue in 2019. These retrofits would also have increased operational costs significantly, as the advanced emission control systems consumed substantial amounts of electricity themselves, reducing net plant efficiency by roughly 4 to 6% and requiring expensive reagents and replacement components. The company's internal financial projections, later obtained by investigators, showed that full compliance would have reduced annual EBITDA by approximately 12%, a devastating impact for a company already facing pressure from renewable energy competition and declining capacity factors at their coal plants. Beyond the direct compliance costs, legitimate emission reductions would have impacted CPI's position in China's national emission trading system, launched in pilot form in 2013, and expanded significantly by 2020. The company had been allocated emission allowances based on historical performance and efficiency benchmarks, but actual compliance with ultra-low standards would have required purchasing additional allowances worth hundreds of millions of yuan annually. CPI's management was also concerned about the impact of honest environmental reporting on their credit ratings and cost of capital, as Chinese banks had begun incorporating environmental performance metrics into lending decisions following regulatory guidance from the People's Bank of China. The company had outstanding debt of approximately 38 billion yuan, much of it in the form of green bonds that carried lower interest rates specifically because of CPI's environmental commitments, meaning that any revelation of non-compliance could trigger higher borrowing costs across their entire capital structure. The scheme required extensive coordination between CPI's corporate headquarters in Hong Kong, regional management offices on the mainland, and individual plant operators across multiple provinces. At the corporate level, the Environmental Affairs Department developed standardized protocols for monitoring system manipulation and provided technical support to ensure consistency across facilities. These protocols were distributed through encrypted communications channels and disguised as routine maintenance procedures to avoid creating obvious documentation of fraudulent intent. Regional managers were responsible for coordinating the timing of manipulations with regulatory inspection schedules, often using informal networks within provincial environmental bureaus to obtain advance notice of planned audits. Plant-level implementation required the cooperation of at least 3 to 5 employees at each facility, including the environmental compliance officer, control room operators with access to the CEMS networks, and maintenance technicians who could perform physical modifications to monitoring equipment. CPI provided financial incentives for participation in the scheme through a bonus system tied to environmental compliance metrics, effectively rewarding employees for successful falsification while maintaining plausible deniability about the underlying fraud. The company also invested in sophisticated IT infrastructure to support the deception, including secure servers located outside mainland China that could remotely access plant monitoring systems and implement coordinated data manipulation across multiple facilities simultaneously. Training for personnel involved in the scheme was conducted through ostensibly legitimate environmental compliance workshops, where employees learned both actual regulations and the technical methods for circumventing monitoring requirements. CPI even developed internal quality control processes for the falsified data, reviewing reported emissions for statistical consistency and ensuring that the fabricated readings would not trigger regulatory scrutiny through obvious patterns or anomalies. The environmental consequences of CPI's falsification scheme were devastating, contributing significantly to air quality problems across multiple Chinese provinces where the company operated major facilities. Internal company documents later revealed that actual emissions from CPI's coal plants were running between 2 and 4 times higher than the levels reported to environmental authorities, meaning that the company's facilities alone were contributing thousands of additional tons of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter to regional air pollution. In Shanxi province, where CPI operated several large coal plants near major population centers, the company's unreported excess emissions were estimated to contribute measurably to PM 2.5 concentrations that regularly exceeded World Health Organization guidelines by factors of 3 to 5 during winter heating seasons. The health impacts were quantifiable through epidemiological analysis, with researchers later estimating that CPI's excess emissions contributed to approximately 1,500 premature deaths annually across their operating regions, along with thousands of cases of respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, and developmental problems in children. The fraud also undermined broader environmental policy effectiveness, as regulators were making decisions about regional emission reduction requirements and industrial development permits based on systematically falsified data from one of the largest emitters in their jurisdictions. CPI's deception effectively shifted pollution burdens onto other industries and facilities that were honestly reporting their emissions and making genuine compliance investments, creating an unfair competitive advantage for the company while penalizing competitors who followed environmental regulations. The falsification scheme also compromised China's national greenhouse gas inventory reporting to international bodies, as CPI's understated emissions data fed into broader calculations of the country's progress toward climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. Beyond immediate environmental harm, the fraud delayed necessary upgrades to China's coal fleet and reduced pressure for legitimate clean technology deployment, effectively slowing the country's energy transition and extending the operational life of highly polluting generation assets. The scheme began to unravel in late 2019 when environmental researchers at Beijing University noticed statistical anomalies in emission monitoring data from several provinces where CPI operated major facilities. The researchers were conducting a study on the effectiveness of China's ultra-low emission standards and found that reported emission reductions at CPI plants were significantly larger and more consistent than comparable facilities operated by other companies, even though CPI had not announced major environmental investments proportional to such dramatic improvements. This academic research caught the attention of environmental regulators, who began conducting more frequent and unannounced inspections at CPI facilities, using portable monitoring equipment to verify the readings from installed CEMS systems. During a surprise inspection at CPI's Pingshan power plant in Hebei province in March 2020, regulatory officials discovered significant discrepancies between their independent measurements and the facility's reported emissions, with actual pollution levels exceeding reported figures by more than 300% during the inspection period. The discovery triggered a comprehensive investigation involving multiple regulatory agencies, including the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, and provincial environmental bureaus across CPI's operating regions. Investigators employed forensic accounting techniques to trace the financial flows related to environmental compliance investments, finding that CPI had claimed capital expenditures for emission control equipment that was never actually purchased or installed. Digital forensics experts analyzing the CEMS networks at CPI facilities uncovered sophisticated software modifications designed to manipulate monitoring data, along with electronic communications between company personnel discussing implementation of the falsification protocols. The investigation was complicated by CPI's attempts to destroy evidence once the scope of regulatory scrutiny became apparent, including the deletion of computer files, destruction of maintenance records, and reassignment of key personnel involved in the scheme to positions outside mainland China, where they would be less accessible to investigators. The criminal and regulatory response to CPI's emissions falsification scheme reflected the Chinese government's increasingly serious approach to environmental enforcement under President Xi Jinping's Ecological Civilization campaign. In October 2020, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment announced the largest environmental penalty in Chinese history, imposing fines totaling 1.2 billion yuan on CPI for systematic violations of emission monitoring requirements across 12 facilities in 8 provinces. The penalty calculation included daily fines for each day of non-compliance dating back to 2017, multiplied by the number of affected facilities and pollution parameters, along with additional penalties for the monitoring system tampering and false reporting. Beyond the financial penalties, regulators ordered CPI to shut down 6 of their most egregiously non-compliant units, pending installation of legitimate emission control equipment, removing approximately 3 gigawatts of generating capacity from the grid, and costing the company an estimated 400 million yuan in lost revenue during the mandated shutdown period. The China Securities Regulatory Commission initiated parallel enforcement action against CPI's listed entity, alleging that the environmental violations constituted material misrepresentations to investors and violated disclosure requirements for companies trading on Chinese exchanges. Criminal charges were filed against 11 CPI executives and employees, including the company's chief environmental officer, 3 regional managers, and 7 plant-level personnel directly involved in implementing the falsification scheme. The charges included environmental crimes under China's revised criminal law, fraud charges related to the manipulation of regulatory reporting systems, and corruption charges for employees who accepted bribes to participate in the scheme. Several defendants received prison sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years, while others faced substantial financial penalties and permanent bars from holding positions in China's power sector. The Ministry of Ecology and Environment also implemented enhanced monitoring requirements for CPI facilities, including mandatory installation of tamper-resistant monitoring equipment, increased inspection frequencies, and requirements for third-party verification of all environmental compliance data. The CPI emissions falsification scheme represents a watershed moment in understanding how corporate fraud can undermine environmental protection and climate policy at a national scale. The case demonstrated that even in countries with increasingly sophisticated environmental monitoring and enforcement systems, determined corporate actors can develop systematic methods to circumvent regulatory oversight, particularly when the financial incentives for non-compliance are substantial and the technical complexity of monitoring systems creates opportunities for manipulation. The scheme's detection ultimately relied on academic researchers rather than regulatory agencies, highlighting the importance of independent monitoring and verification in environmental enforcement. For investors, the CPI case illustrates the risks of ESG investing in sectors where companies face high compliance costs and complex regulatory requirements, as the pressure to maintain profitability while meeting environmental standards can create powerful incentives for fraudulent misrepresentation. The sophisticated nature of CPI's falsification methods, involving both technical manipulation of monitoring systems and elaborate organizational coordination, suggests that traditional regulatory oversight mechanisms may be insufficient to detect well-planned corporate environmental fraud. The case also reveals how environmental crimes can have quantifiable public health consequences, with CPI's excess emissions contributing to measurable increases in air pollution-related illness and mortality across their operating regions. From a policy perspective, the scheme demonstrates the critical importance of monitoring system integrity in environmental regulation, as even the most stringent emission standards become meaningless if the underlying compliance data can be systematically falsified. The CPI case has prompted regulatory reforms across multiple countries, including enhanced tamper resistance requirements for emission monitoring equipment, increased penalties for environmental data fraud, and new requirements for independent verification of corporate environmental claims. Ultimately, the China Power International Emissions Falsification Scheme serves as a stark reminder that the transition to cleaner energy requires not only appropriate policies and technologies, but also robust enforcement mechanisms capable of detecting and deterring corporate actors who would prioritize short-term profits over environmental protection and public health.